This is the first part of the video that I have written, and I'm currently writing this before I have started doing the research for what I, even now, understand will be the most colossal undertaking of my entire channel. The Palestinian Israeli Peace Process is one which triggers such visceral, desperate arguing that even calling it a peace process is itself a contentious issue. Despite all of this, or in fact, in spite of all of this, I will commit myself entirely to the truth and entirely towards as useful an analysis of this period of history that I can attempt. I will also mostly be focusing on the peace negotiations as they relate to Palestine, and any mention of the negotiations between other states and Israel will be done in order to add context. Of course, this is no easy task. I am a stakeholder in this process after all. The political future which members of my family live under is determined by how the world views this history and considers what the solution should be. I consequently have my own convictions concerning this issue, but I'm not here to tell you all what I think should happen. I want to establish some facts and describe what actually happened in the period of time that I am covering. Many people have very strong opinions about this period of time, but also don't seem to know that much about what happened, and I have decided that before people make up their minds, they should at least engage with the history of this matter. By the time I finish this script, I will have read hundreds of pages on the subject by numerous authors. All of the sources I have used to create this narrative are, as with all of my videos, in the description, if you too are crazy enough to go through with this. The year is 1947, and the UN has suggested to partition what used to be the Mandate of Palestine. The Palestinians and the Arab states oppose this partition, and the Zionists accept it, believing it to be a foundation for a Jewish state, and Palestine was set ablaze. A civil war had begun between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. The Palestinian Arabs were unprepared for this war and began being ethnically cleansed from their villages. Arab armies later invaded after the Zionists declared independence, and by 1949, 750,000 men, women, and children were forced out of their homes, their property confiscated by the State of Israel, and their citizenship abrogated. Israel has now decreed them absentees and has taken their land. The UN released another resolution in 1948, United Nations Resolution 194, which states in Article 11 that the General Assembly resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss of or damage to property which, under principles of international or inequity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. The refugees would, over the remaining century, wage a campaign of national liberation and guerrilla warfare in order to reclaim their land and destroy the State of Israel, returning the entire land back to the Palestinian Arabs. From 1948 to 1967, many Palestinian groups in the diaspora would participate in this struggle. But the hope for the liberation of Palestine at this point was mostly placed into the hands of Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. The amount of charisma and influence that he exuded in the Arab world, while not entirely dulling the Palestinian desires to liberate their homeland by themselves, convinced many Palestinians that it would be Nasser who would potentially destroy Israel. In 1967, the prospect of Egypt ever destroying Israel completely vanished. As tensions rose between Israel and its neighbors, Israel preemptively attacked Egypt. Starting on June 5, 1967, in 6 days, Israel captured and subsequently occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. East Jerusalem was annexed by Israel on June 28 that same year. The UN, in response, released United Nations Resolution 242, which 1. Affirms that the fulfillment of Charter principles requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, which would include the application of both the following principles. withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, terminations of all claims of states of belligerency, and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and the right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. 2. Affirms further the necessity for guaranteeing freedom of navigation through international waterways in the area, for achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem, for guaranteeing the territorial inviolability and political independence of every state in the area. The Israelis decided that the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights would be bargained with in exchange for peace. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank, on the other hand, spurred a debate. Some suggested annexation, and questions concerning voting rights for Palestinians and citizenship were thrown around. In the end, as it was put by Prime Minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, they made a decision not to decide, and allowed the settlement of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to begin. Concerning the Arabs, the embarrassing military defeat left the liberation of Palestine entirely in the hands of the Palestinian militant groups, and it invigorated the Palestinian national consciousness. Al-Harakat al-Tahrir al-Watani al-Falastini, or Fatah, founded in October 1959, engaged in a battle with Israel called the Battle of Karama in 1968, in which it cemented itself as a leading organization of the Palestinian national movement. Later in 1969, Yasser Arafat, the leader of Fatah, was appointed the chairman of the PLO. From 1969 to 1973, the PLO's goal was recovering lost Palestinian land and creating a secular democratic state. Meanwhile, Egypt, now under Anwar Sadat, had been attempting to regain Egypt's territory of the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had begun building settlements in the Sinai and refused to negotiate with Sadat. In 1973, Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Hafez al-Assad of Syria invaded Israel, both with the intention of regaining their territory. The war was a genuine shock for Israel, which had ignored intelligence reports and was only able to turn the tide with the introduction of American weaponry. The 1973 war resulted in a conference at Geneva with the US, the Soviets, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. From 1973 to 1978, with the facilitation of US Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and later Jimmy Carter, Egypt had begun negotiating with Israel a peace treaty, and here, finally, the framework for the Palestinian Israeli Peace Process would begin to take root. Though this conference achieved nothing, it did inspire the PLO to rethink its diplomatic options. The subsequent year of 1974 was a big one for the PLO. In 1974, the Arab League and the UN recognized the PLO as the representatives of the Palestinian people, turning what was then a group internationally recognized as terrorists into fellow statesmen, cemented by a speech given by Yasser Arafat to the UN. From the inception of Fatah all the way up to 1974, Arafat had remained committed to reclaiming the entirety of Palestine. But in 1974, internally he had begun believing that these lands would be lost forever. Despite advances in the Egyptian peace treaty, the Palestinian question had not been meaningfully addressed for the majority of this period. A big factor in this was the approach of Henry Kissinger. As Secretary of State, Kissinger's main goal was balancing the powers of the Middle East and ending conflict piece by piece. This means that a diplomatic solution between Egypt and Israel would not have to include addressing the Palestinians. The Israelis were opposed to the idea of Palestinian self-determination and negotiating with the PLO, and in response, Kissinger promised that the US would not engage with the PLO unless the PLO accepted UN Resolution 242, and acknowledged Israel's right to exist. Things would change with the election of Jimmy Carter. Before becoming president, Carter's understanding of Israel was almost entirely shaped by his Christian background. He believed in Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state as ordained by God. At the same time, he was also informed by his belief in human rights and equality. During his campaign, Carter was quickly joined by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who would later become the National Security Advisor. Brzezinski would champion a solution to the question of the Palestinians in the forms of a think tank-produced document called the Brookings Report. This called for a comprehensive peace plan, Israeli withdrawal to 1967 borders, and either a Palestinian entity that would be federated with Jordan or a full-blown Palestinian state. President Carter's position towards the Palestinians would develop, as demonstrated in his use of the term homeland during a town hall meeting in Clinton, Massachusetts, 1977. The Jewish American community flipped out at the use of this phrase. They had, as Carter's Jewish community liaison put it, a morbid fear of a Palestinian state. Palestinians welcomed this as a step in the right direction, despite it only being rhetoric. Carter's slight turn towards Palestinian self-determination wasn't met very positively by Israel's Rabin government established in 1974. Member of Israel's ruling coalition, Moshe Dayan, responded to these attempts at peace by rebuffing them. He said that Israel is not willing to pay the price for peace treaties with Arab states, that Israel has every right to be in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that if Israel offered peace tied to full withdrawal, it would oppose peace. Yitzhak Rabin, on the other hand, supported negotiations with Arab states, but not with the PLO. He imagined that the parts of the West Bank would be annexed by Jordan, and other parts would be annexed by Israel. In regards to the West Bank, he said, "We may claim it, but we have not annexed any other territory. We have left it open." He supported settlement, which Carter frankly told him was illegal. Relationships between the two were chilly, as Rabin felt that Carter was trying to push the Brookings Report onto him, and Carter felt that Rabin didn't like him. Regardless of what Rabin might have thought, all of this became irrelevant on April 8, 1977, when he resigned due to corruption investigations over a bank account scandal. An election had to be held afterwards, and in what was called a revolution at the time, the Israeli electorate chose the Likud-led coalition of Menachem Begin on May 17, 1977. The defeat of the Israeli Labor Party and its coalition threw a monkey wrench into the Americans' negotiating plans. The Likud was seen as less moderate as compared to the Labor Party. The PLO responded to his election by proclaiming Begin exposed Israel as a fascist country. Now, both the Labor-led coalition and the newly elected Likud-led coalition supported settlements in Palestine. So, in that regard, they were pretty similar. But nonetheless, it caused a commotion. Menachem Begin was born in Brest, Belarus, and upon settling in mandatory Palestine, he became involved in the revisionist Zionist movement. Later, he would become the successor of its founder, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and the leader of the Zionist terrorist organization of the Irgun, which would be responsible for the Deir Yassin massacre during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The Irgun not only claimed what is today the West Bank, but also what is today Jordan, as envisioned by their nifty logo. Begin explicitly rejected the Jordan plan, where the West Bank and Gaza Strip would be given to Jordan, and insisted that these lands be held by Israel forever. When asked as to what would happen to the Arabs of Judea and Samaria, as Begin put it, Begin claimed that they would be given citizenship and equal rights. But Brzezinski pushed his administration on this position, claiming the demographic realities would contradict the viability of Israel as a Jewish state. The answer to Begin was simple. They would settle as many Jews as possible until the ratio changed. It must also be noted that Begin, at the outset of the conquest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, advocated that Palestinians not be given rights. In a legal argument that would be parroted by successive Israeli politicians in the future, the settlements were deemed not illegal at all, and that Resolution 242 did not mean that Israel had to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. As Begin put it, these lands would not be placed under any foreign rule or sovereignty on the basis of two factors. 1. Our people's right to the land. It is our land as our right. 2. Our national security. Other members of his administration, notably Moshe Dayan, who had switched political alignments, argued for the implementation of what was called the Ilan Plan. Named after Yigal Allon, who proposed this plan in 1967, he called for annexing portions of the West Bank and Gaza while giving limited autonomy to Palestinian municipalities or attaching them to Jordan. The goal here being the maximum amount of land as possible while keeping the maximum number of Palestinians out of it. Begin refused, any and all negotiations with the PLO, believing them to be the inheritors of the legacy of the German Nazis. The PLO had begun to come around to the idea of accepting Resolution 242 around the same time that Begin was elected. Arafat had told Carter that he would be willing to accept 242 if the United States had made assurances that the Palestinians would be allowed to have a state in some part of historic Palestine. The Palestinians felt that they needed this assurance because 242 does not explicitly guarantee a Palestinian homeland. Arafat argued that since Palestinians were willing to accept a Palestinian state in 23% of Palestine, and that since Israel was a dangerous nuclear power, the United States should be more supportive of a Palestinian state. To Begin, this was tantamount to breaking the agreement that Kissinger had made with Israel, and he questioned America's morality. Despite all of this, Begin was willing to negotiate with Egypt and Syria, but not on the status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Carter administration would continue to push the issue of Palestinian autonomy to Begin. A conference at Geneva was being assembled, and here it was hoped that many of the issues of all of the interested parties would be solved. After Begin became prime minister on June 21st, the Carter administration presented their principles for this Geneva conference to Begin on July 19th to the 20th. One of the principles included was a call for Palestinians to be able to choose what their own future should be. Begin rejected this. Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, still persisted in trying to include Palestinian representation at Geneva, eventually securing a representation for the PLO as part of a unified Arab delegation who was also, as per the Kissinger Agreement, not part of the PLO. There were still many procedural issues that concerned the PLO and the Syrians, and in response, the United States decided to put out a statement in tandem with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had earlier presented their draft of the statement to the United States, and the US agreed to publish it, thinking this would pressure the PLO and the Syrians to commit to the procedure of the conference. The document was mild. It did not call for a Palestinian state or PLO participation, but it did mention a reference to Palestinians having legitimate rights. When it was published in October 1st, 1977, the public backlash from Israel, pro-Israel Americans, and Cold Warriors was extremely harsh. In a conversation between Vice President Walter Mondale, the representative for the American Jewish Committee, spelled out what the contention was. He said, "Palestinian rights means to the Jewish community the destruction of Israel." The Israelis asked if they could just not accept the communique, and Carter relented. The Israelis went further and pressed Carter to make public the commitments he had made with Israel, or else they would publish them themselves. Moshe Dayan, picking up on the backlash that this communique was receiving from Jewish Americans in particular, told Carter that they could release a joint statement on the Geneva conference, which Carter accepted and did. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a lone voice advocating that this domestic pressure should not deter Washington's interest, and decried what he felt was manipulation from the Israelis. For Carter, his hands were tied, and he felt he could not make any more moves, and Carter implied in a letter to Sadat that for peace to be achieved, he would have to take the initiative. Sadat responded on November 9th, announcing that he would visit Jerusalem in order to speak directly to the Israelis. On November 19th, he visited the Israeli Knesset. This was met with cautious encouragement from the United States, enthusiasm from the Israelis, and condemnation from the PLO. The U.S., going into the direct Egypt and Israel negotiations, thought that despite the PLO and Syria not being involved, they could still work in some sort of agreement on the West Bank and Gaza. In December of that year, Begin visited Washington in an attempt to get the Americans on board for this plan. In regards to the Palestinians, he wanted the U.S. to adopt his proposal of home rule for Palestinians under occupation. Supposedly, Palestinians would be given equal rights to Israelis and would be given the option of becoming citizens of Israel. The Palestinians in the occupied territories would have a local authority that ran local affairs. However, Israel would control security, and the occupied territories would have to be open to the attempt to settle and acquire land from Israel. Brzezinski and Vance pushed the Israelis on this plan, asking about how much control would actually be delegated to this local authority if Israel were to control security and settlement. The Israelis responded that the military governor would be able to revoke powers from this local authority should it impede Israeli security. One example that was given was immigration, which Israel sought to control in this hypothetical plan. A concern over Palestinian autonomy was that the Palestinians, led by the PLO, would allow all the refugees to return and be concentrated in the West Bank, where they could potentially attack Israel from with more success. Sadat shared his dislike of the PLO, especially concerning communist elements in the PLO. He said that,
"There is Arafat and that fanatic George Habash. He has declared himself a Marxist-Leninist."
To Sadat, who had earlier expelled Soviet advisors and was trying to push Egypt out of the Soviet orbit and into the American one, this was bad news. Regardless of the issues the Americans had with this plan, they felt that it would be a good plan for a transition to a Palestinian state of some form in the future. They thought that they could trick Begin into turning this proposal into a 5-year transitional phase. Witnessing Begin's intransigence on issues concerning the occupied territories and settlements in the Sinai, the Americans began to work more heavily with Sadat in order to pressure the negotiations. They asked Sadat to make more tough proposals so that America could appear as a power that had to moderate Egypt. The Sadat-Carter Accord of February of 1978, however, failed to pressure Begin. This failed, and eventually they had to enter the Camp David summit in order to finally come to an agreement. From September 5th to September 17th, Begin, Sadat, and Carter, along with all of their homies, discussed a wide range of topics and plans for the future. They discussed the occupied territories on September 16th, the literal last day. Begin effectively had delayed this issue to the last possible day. Begin was also able to win on almost every position he had concerning the occupied territories. He was able to separate Jordan and the Palestinians as distinct negotiating parties. He was able to prevent a settlement freeze that lasted longer than the Egyptian and Israeli negotiations, and he was able to create enough ambiguity in the language of the agreement that the results of the negotiations over the occupied territories didn't have to be based in Resolution 242. On May 26, 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. Now, between Camp David and this peace treaty, a lot of the underlying issues of the occupied territories were heavily discussed. The Americans and the Egyptians attempted to use whatever leverage they could in order to get Begin to implement their version of the autonomy plan, which in their mind would be transitional. The issue is that Begin had different plans. In Begin's mind, he had only agreed to instituting an interim period of autonomy that, after 5 years, would directly lead to annexation. If the Palestinians refused, he would continue autonomy indefinitely and continue to build settlements to take land. Begin also refused to give a specific date for the election of this so-called self-governing authority. His understanding of autonomy would, as time moved on, be revealed as being much more restrictive than a lot of his paternalistic and supposedly benevolent rhetoric had earlier suggested. Israel would control land and water resources. Its security forces would be allowed to operate in the occupied territories. They would have control over public order, political activity, censorship, and immigration. The military government would indeed be the source of any authority wielded by the Palestinians in order to ensure the expansion of settlement. The Israelis continued to settle mostly in order to make any Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, especially the West Bank, as impossible as possible. As the then Minister of Agriculture and proclaimed settlement czar, Ariel Sharon, put it, "The facts that were created in the areas, the skeleton, the map that exists practically in the area now, does not allow anymore and will not enable in the future any territorial compromise. I don't see any possibility of territorial compromise." Interestingly enough, in these negotiations concerning the fate of the Palestinians, it was determined that the collective brain tissue between Carter, Begin, and Sadat was so powerful that it could accurately understand the needs of the Palestinians for them. All jokes aside, no Palestinians were present in these discussions at all. Members of the Carter administration, like Secretary Vance, wanted to include the PLO, but there was a major concern over the backlash that this decision would receive from America's Jewish community. Arafat, however, was able to make some inroads in Europe by arranging a meeting between the Austrian and West German chancellors, which bolstered his legitimacy. Any attempt to get closer to the PLO in the US achieved no results, as is determined by the case of the American ambassador to the UN, Andrew Young, who met with a member of the PLO secretly, had this information leaked by the Mossad, and was promptly fired for breaching US policy. In the later years of Carter's presidency, his ability to act towards pursuing his own vision for the Middle East severely declined. The young incident aside, he was now also catching a lot of flack for his handling of the Iranian Revolution and subsequent hostage crisis. Egypt, for its part, had been struggling to push the Israelis into accepting the idea of Palestinian self-determination. But without Palestinian participation, they were reluctant to make a decision. Moshe Dayan, as well, found Begin's idea of autonomy to be insufficient to his own standards and resigned as a result. Carter would go on to lose the presidency, and Sadat would go on to continue to press the Israelis on the issue of self-determination. But it was clear that by decoupling Israeli withdrawal of the Sinai and by exhausting the political will of Jimmy Carter, that Begin had more or less ensured Israel's grasp of the occupied territory for the time being. Ronald Wilson Reagan would be elected President of the United States in November of 1980. As president, he reviewed the Palestinian issue through the lens of the Cold War. The Palestinians were backed by the Soviets, and the Israelis were backed by the United States. Reagan vowed to uphold the 1975 Kissinger Agreement as a result, and refused negotiations with the PLO. Reagan would go on to deem settlements as not illegal. His appointment of Alexander Haig as the Secretary of State also proved to be a big win for the Prime Minister, Begin, as Haig was extremely pro-Israel. Haig, for example, had agreed to Begin's use of a Cold War framework to ensure no sovereignty for Palestinians and endorsed his autonomy plan. In October of 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by Islamists and replaced by his president Hosni Mubarak. Egypt afterwards chose to only pursue an agreement acceptable to Palestinians and the Arab world, much to the chagrin of Haig and Israel. Mubarak would return to the previous government's position of discussion. Haig explained the brief rupture to the Israelis. You have a very sophisticated, enlightened, communicative society. Everyone knows and understands what is going on. They may not draw the same conclusion from this fact, but that is not true in Egypt. Never has been, never will be. At the beginning of the decade, the idea of a Palestinian state, let alone an Israeli withdrawal, seemed very unlikely. Slowly but surely, however, this would change. Firstly, Reagan's administration was not united in total, blind support for Menachem Begin. Reagan was not regarded as a very decisive policymaker and relied heavily on his aides to make political decisions, and on the issue of Israel and Palestine, people like Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger pushed against blank checks for Israel, or anything that would endanger upsetting the moderate, in quotes, Arab Gulf monarchies who he had ties to. Weinberger pressed hard on Reagan to suspend his Memorandum of Understanding with Israel in reaction to the annexation of the Golan Heights. In his words, "How long do we have to go on bribing Israel?" 1982 would be a year of immense change in the dynamics of the Palestinian and Israeli political process, due to many tragic and sudden events. They were all set off by Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Israel invaded Lebanon on June 6th in order to destroy the PLO. They justified this invasion based on an assassination attempt on their ambassador in London by the Abu Nidal organization. Now, these guys are wild and in and of themselves deserve their own video. Yes, I know I keep saying that. But what's important here to understand is that the ANO wasn't a member of the PLO, and even fought the PLO, attempting and succeeding in assassinating its own leaders, failing to kill Mahmoud Abbas in the late 70s, but succeeding to kill PLO official Issam Sortawi in 1983. The inciting event, therefore, was of little consequence, and was based on the political goals of one Ariel Sharon, who at this point in time was the defense minister. His goal was to destroy any hope for Palestinian nationalism by destroying the PLO in order to advance the annexation of the West Bank into Israel. However, the opposite happened. Israel's advancement into Lebanon went farther than the US was led to believe, and troubled by the scenes of violence he had been shown, Reagan told Israel to accept a ceasefire. Haig, who wanted Israel to be given the chance to destroy the PLO, was against this, and in turn resigned, losing Israel a vital ally in Reagan's regime, and putting George Shultz as the new Secretary of State, who was relatively less supportive of Israel, and who also had ties to the Gulf monarchies. Schultz pushed for a new vision of peace, which included a PLO withdrawal from Lebanon as requisite for negotiations and basically a Reagan version of the Jordan Plan. On September 1st of 1982, Reagan laid out this vision. Begin was pissed. In his reply to Reagan's speech, he said, "What some call the West Bank, Mr. President, is Judea and Samaria." The PLO agreed to leave Lebanon under the assurance that the United States would ensure that the Palestinian refugees would not be harmed for the rest of the war. 10,000 PLO fighters left for Tunisia, which remained their base of operation until Oslo. Somehow, they had prevailed from the Israeli assault. The Israelis had previously pushed all the way into Beirut, where they now had control over the Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps. From the evening of September 16th and the afternoon of September 18th, Israeli-backed members of the fascist Phalange militia entered the camps and slaughtered, raped, and killed at least 800 men, women, and children under the lights of Israeli flares. In the cabinet meeting before this assault concerning the Phalange's entry into these camps, Sharon had this to say about any potential for violence. "The results will speak for themselves. Let us have the number of days necessary for destroying the terrorists." Despite the PLO leaving Lebanon, Sharon made no distinction between refugees and PLO fighters, and the shocking carnage that had occurred shook the world's perception of Israel. It is most likely that the excruciatingly slow turn against Israel and public opinion began with this massacre. Israel could no longer claim a monopoly on morality. Sharon was forced to leave his position as defense minister, yet still participated in politics. He was found by an Israeli commission to be partly responsible for the massacre, to which he accused his detractors of hypocrisy due to their support for other Phalange-initiated massacres, such as at the Tel el-Zoltar camp. Begin, partly due to how terribly this war had been going, but mostly because he was sad that his wife died, resigned and left Israeli political life in August of 1983. Palestinian nationalism was emboldened by this tragedy, not destroyed. Arafat was able to appeal to the world to be more supportive of Palestinian self-determination. "I turn to every human being in the world to come here and see this great power, the Israeli army, what it did against the Palestinians, to our refugees, to our women and children." However, the idea of a Palestinian state would still not be openly considered by anyone other than the PLO. Reagan still pushed for a union with Jordan. The PLO and Jordan, in turn, in 1985, adopted a joint position which would make a Palestinian state as part of a federation with Jordan. Israel, after the resignation of Begin, was run by Yitzhak Shamir, someone more hard-line than Begin, which was part of the Stern Group, or Lehi, which was a downright fascist organization that committed many crimes during the Nakba. Israel had an election in 1984 in which Shamir and Labour Party member Shimon Peres would rotate as Prime Minister of Israel. Both opposed the PLO-Jordan International Conference, and eventually in 1986, Jordan dropped it, after some secret negotiations with Peres, which called for joint Jordanian and Israeli rule of the West Bank. Many other attempts were made to kill the idea of a Palestinian state. The Americans, Jordanians, and Israelis attempted to sideline the PLO by increasing Jordanian influence in the West Bank and Gaza via a quality of life initiative. They wanted to cultivate an alternative leadership that they could control. This initiative was led by the National Security Council, with the noted contribution of one Dennis Ross. Ross supported this initiative because he believed that if Palestinians embraced what he called radicalism, then leaders like Sharon, Eitan, and others will gain more clout and pursue their objective of depopulating the West Bank of Arabs. This last attempt to sideline the PLO was the creation of the London Document, and a secretly negotiated initiative between Peres, who was the foreign minister at this time, and Jordan. Shamir, who was the prime minister, wasn't invited and rejected this plan. Despite all attempts to sideline the PLO and to destroy the idea of an independent Palestinian state, something which had been bubbling under the surface for decades would eventually blindside everyone and put an independent Palestinian state on the agenda. The Israelis, for the most part, viewed their occupation and colonization of Palestine as something that was good for Palestinians. Many leaders point to Gaza as an example of the benevolence of Israeli rule. During the Rabin premiership, then Defense Minister Shimon Peres said this about Gaza: It is the most tranquil part of the area under Israeli administration. Israel feels that whatever happens, it must behave as a responsible government and permit a normal life for the Gazans. Begin felt that the settlements were not detrimental to the well-being of Palestinians. This view of a benevolent occupation, however, was very far from the truth. Many Palestinians were concerned over what would happen to them via Begin's autonomy scheme. They were very upset by the increase of Israeli settlers. The Sabra and Shatila massacre had also enraged them. Coupled with decades of military occupation and displacement, they began to become increasingly sick of their occupiers and increased their resolve to do something about it. In 1977, Israel recorded 656 disturbances in the West Bank. In 1981, it was 1,556. In 1984, it was 2,663. The Israelis, in a previous attempt to quash Palestinian nationalism, attempted to create a leadership other than the PLO via Israeli-appointed leaders of village leagues, consisting of people who would collaborate with the occupation. Palestinians saw this as what it was and responded with riots and civil disobedience, ending this scheme. It was all building towards something, and eventually exploded on December 8th of 1987. An Israeli army vehicle rammed into Palestinian workers returning from Israel to Gaza. The Israelis killed 4 workers. The next day, the funeral had brought people out in major demonstrations, to which Israeli soldiers responded by shooting into the crowd, killing people with live fire. The Palestinians formed the United National Leadership of the Uprising, which distributed thousands of leaflets encouraging people to take up unarmed resistance against the Israeli occupation. By the end of December, 22 people were already killed. By the end of the First Intifada, over 1,000 people were killed, and 120,000 people were arrested by Israel. The UNLU demanded an end to settlements, a Palestinian state, the ability to make contact with the PLO, and an end to land confiscation. Rabin, the defense minister at the time, advocated the use of beatings and bone breaking in order to end the Intifada. 30 people were beaten to death as a result. The Intifada, regardless of this thuggish and authoritarian response, persisted. The Intifada brought about a couple of changes in regards to the history of these negotiations. The pressure that the protesters were exuding forced the hands of many politicians to take actions in response, the first of which was the death of the Jordan Plan. The Jordanians in 1988 dropped all claims to the West Bank and refused to continue negotiating on behalf of the Palestinians. Now the only valid choice was a Palestinian state, and negotiating with the PLO. But getting the PLO to the negotiating table would be in and of itself an immense struggle. Before the Jordanians relinquished their claim to the occupied territory, Secretary Schultz had been attempting one last-ditch effort, with his remaining time in office, to push forward bilateral negotiations between Israel and a Palestinian-Jordanian delegation in an international conference. Shamir rejected this proposal, going so far as to declare war against it. Schultz's plan did, however, introduce a new idea into the peace process, an interlock between a transitional period and final status negotiations. This would all be predicated on all parties accepting UN Resolution 242. The Jordanians relinquished their claim in July of 1988, and thus the Americans would not negotiate without the PLO accepting 242. The PLO dropped the requirement for American support of a Palestinian state, and in November of 1988 had accepted both 242 and 338. However, gaps still had to be closed between the Americans and the Palestinians before they would force the issue of an international conference. Schultz did not want to endorse the idea of a Palestinian state, and still would not negotiate directly with the PLO. These gaps would be closed from an unlikely place. The Swedish Foreign Minister Sten Andersson had begun creating connections between prominent American Jews under the leadership of Rita Hauser, a former ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council. Together with PLO officials, while keeping Schultz informed, they drafted a statement that they would ask Arafat to make so that the United States would recognize the PLO. Arafat made a statement condemning terrorism, but to Schultz it was not good enough. He expected a verbatim repetition of the drafted statement. So this time, Arafat renounced it. Finally, though, the United States was on board, and on December 14th, the ban for dealing with the PLO was lifted. Despite this, the Americans still refused to endorse statehood, and only acknowledged the PLO had the right to bring it up in negotiations. Now, to make sure that everyone gets the full picture of the controversy over this decision to accept these resolutions, I'm going to touch upon those who rejected negotiations and a partition of Palestine, first of which were the classic rejectionists. In 1974, the PLO released its 10-point program, which implicitly accepted the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. Many factions in the PLO formed the rejectionist front in response. The most prominent member of this was the PFLP, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. As the PLO became closer and closer to the prospect of negotiating this subject, many members became more explicit in their desire to settle for only part of Palestine. Members of the PFLP were kicked out, for example, and Arafat was condemned for meeting with Mubarak, who had recognized Israel. However, as the Intifada began, a new leadership emerged that would soon come to overshadow groups like the PFLP in terms of leading a rejection of the partition of Palestine, namely Hamas. By beginning negotiations with Israel, Arafat basically had bet his entire political clout in Palestine on achieving results. Otherwise, it would prove these critics right. 1988 was also important in that it was an election year for Israel and the United States. The Israelis chose Yitzhak Shamir, and this time he did not need to govern with his opposition. The Americans chose George H.W. Bush. Bush was extremely experienced in the realm of foreign policy after a long career in politics, yet his views on foreign affairs were usually kept very close to the chest, a trait he had shared with his Secretary of State, James A. Baker III. The Bush administration had begun its approach to the issue of Palestine by considering that Shamir could be convinced to negotiate and that the onus for progress was on the hands of the Palestinians. In the following years, this assumption would slowly be challenged. When Shamir proposed his initiative for peace, it ruled out withdrawal from the occupied territories and negotiations with the PLO. Over a week later, on May 22nd, Baker made clear what the U.S. position would be in front of an annual AIPAC conference.
Now it is the time to lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel. Israeli interests in the West Bank and Gaza, security and otherwise, can be accommodated in a settlement based on Resolution 242. Forswear annexation, stop settlement activity, allow schools to open, reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights.
Around the same time, the Cold War ended, as the Soviet-backed regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed. There was now an inclination to cooperate between the two superpowers. Palestinians' struggle against Israel could no longer be seen as purely a Soviet-US proxy conflict anymore. Baker worked towards bringing the PLO into some real negotiations. Finally. He told the PLO that the Palestinians could only be involved if their delegation included those who were not part of the PLO. The PLO could choose a list of delegates, whose power would come from the PLO. But these delegates had to be approved by Israel and the United States. After some misunderstandings and some issues in bringing people from East Jerusalem, the PLO accepted this initiative. Baker's initiative would soon face two challenges. First would come from the Israelis. Shamir's right-wing allies promised to leave the coalition if he accepted this plan, and the Likud establishment was against it too. And while Shamir also did not support a Palestinian state, he needed an excuse to reject this plan. With the advent of Gorbachev easing restrictions on Soviet citizens, many Soviet Jews began to head to Israel. The Israeli government began to build settlements for them in the occupied territories. Bush had continued Reagan's position on the legality of the settlements, but was very adamant that they were obstacles to peace. He spoke out against settlements, singling out those in East Jerusalem, feeling that Shamir had lied to him. Shamir rejected his plan on these grounds. A power struggle in the Knesset ensued, where Shimon Peres attempted to pry some parties away from Shamir, but this failed, and Shamir survived. The next obstacle came in regards to the PLO. Frustrated by Shamir's political deadlock, the PLO and the U.S. would be set off by a series of unfortunate events that would undo a lot of the progress in the relationship. On May 20th, an IDF veteran named Ami Pappe, posing as an IDF soldier, requested Palestinian workers to stand in a line in order to check their IDs. After they lined up, he shot them, killing 7 and fleeing the scene. Palestinians rioted in response, and the Israelis killed 19 more Palestinians. This would be known as the Aoun Qara massacre. And it would push Arafat to call the UN to do something about Israeli violence against Palestinians. The U.S. initially supported this initiative, but would rescind their support after a raid on Tel Aviv by the Palestinian Liberation Front. Now, the raid did not kill anyone, but the PLF was still part of the PLO. The PLF's membership, however, was frozen, so they did not have any decision-making power. Regardless, this raid and the PLF's inclusion in the PLO convinced Bush to rescind U.S. support for the UN resolution, and it caused a rift in U.S.-PLO relations. At this time, Iraq, under Saddam, was appealing to the Arab world to become more anti-American, and given this rift that began to grow between the U.S. and the PLO, Arafat began to lean towards Saddam. This move by Arafat caused a lot of alarm with his deputy, Saleh Khalaf, better known as Abu Iyad. Abu Iyad was crucial in pushing for more pragmatism in the PLO, and had noted that the PLF was backed by Iraq. He concluded that Saddam was trying to bring the PLO under his influence, and that a break with Washington would be disadvantageous. 5 days later, on July 20th, the U.S. suspended its dialogue with the PLO. Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait, and Arafat supported it, which severely alienated him from the other Arab regimes. Even Syria under Assad did not support Iraq. Abu Iyad would go on to be assassinated by the Abu Nidal organization, which had ties to Iraq. The invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent Gulf War would signify a shift in the power dynamics of the Middle East that had a severe influence on the political process between the PLO and Israel, one of which would be a substantial increase in the U.S. role in the Middle East. In a response to Saddam's rhetoric linking his occupation of Kuwait to Syria's occupation of Lebanon and Israel's occupation of Palestine, the Americans felt the need to return towards finding a solution towards the Israeli and Palestinian peace process. But they also did not want to deal with Arafat anymore. This would culminate in the Madrid Conference in 1991. The conference was created with a diminished role for the PLO, who would only be able to participate via their delegates composed of local leaders in the occupied territories and the diaspora. The delegates at this time were represented by Hanan Ashrawi and Faisal Husseini. From October 3rd to November 1st of 1991, face-to-face discussions between Israelis and Palestinians began. Shamir was also eventually dragged in, but he was, as an attendee would later recall, acting truculent and defiant. Following this conference would be even more conferences in Moscow and Washington, where various issues were discussed. This was basically the first time Palestinians had actually been involved in a negotiating process. However, as per Shamir's request, the conference had no teeth, and people did not expect it to achieve anything in and of itself, but regarded it as a first step towards a political negotiation. The negotiations in Washington were focused on working towards an interim self-government, but other issues like the occupation, the settlements, East Jerusalem, refugees, etc. were deemed final status issues to be discussed after the interim government was achieved. The Palestinians opposed this as it was an imbalanced framework for discussion. As Ashrawi would point out, there was a legitimate concern that this would result in Palestinians being frozen in autonomy, a point which, in reviewing the Likud's entire history, as well as some other information I will go over in just a bit, was entirely valid. The Palestinian delegation also appealed heavily to the Americans to address their concerns over continued settlement expansion. To the Palestinian, these appeals were necessary due to the power imbalance. Realistically, Israel could just refuse any Palestinian proposal brought up. The Palestinian proposal was called the Pisgah, or the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority. It gave an interim government full jurisdiction over the occupied territories, including land, airspace, and water. It would have a Palestinian-elected government as well. Baker received this proposal positively. The Israeli proposal was basically a Shamir version of the Begin autonomy scheme. The Israelis rebuked the Palestinian proposal for being a Palestinian state in all but name, and therefore a threat to Israel. The Palestinian delegates were becoming extremely frustrated with this proposal. Ashrawi began calling the negotiations a charade. They asked the Americans how they could even negotiate over land that was in the process of being stolen. America was concerned with using too much force against Israel in fear of raising Arab hopes that America could be relied upon in order to achieve concessions. Baker maintained that,
"I can't wave a wand and stop the settlements. I can't wave a wand here and stop the administrative detentions."
The Americans continued to insist that Palestinians negotiate with Israel, despite there being no real offer for a state, and tried to convince the Palestinians that an interim agreement could eventually result in a state. Now, the Americans knew that Israel was not going to make a deal with the Palestinians while Yitzhak Shamir was president, and that is pretty much evidenced by their approach to the Israeli elections of 1992. As previously mentioned, the Israelis began putting newly arrived Soviet Jews in West Bank settlements. What I didn't mention was that the Israelis requested $10 billion from the United States to integrate these Jews, and would use that money to build settlements. Bush postponed the decision on the loan guarantee in an attempt to assure the Palestinians that the U.S. was a serious partner to peace. Bush decided that during the Israeli election year, he would use this loan guarantee issue in order to create a settlement freeze or sabotage Shamir's election prospects. When Rabin, whom the Americans favored, was chosen to lead the Labor Party, they knew that not putting conditions on the loans would result in a Shamir victory, and thus Bush rejected any compromise. Shamir lost and would be replaced by Rabin on June 23rd that year. Rabin was also able to form a relatively left-wing coalition and cancel the plans for 6,000 housing units. This was not a settlement freeze, since Rabin continued to construct 10,000 units, but Bush had gotten his preferred Israeli into office. He approved the loan guarantee afterwards, with the caveat that money would be deducted when it was used for settlements. With all his efforts, he still lost his election to one William Clinton, who I will get into in a little bit. With Shamir gone, progress was now possible for the Palestinian delegation, and they sensed that they finally would have a chance to have a state. Upon losing the election, Shamir revealed that he had never been seriously negotiating with the Palestinians at all. He confirmed as such in an interview, saying that, "It pains me greatly that in the coming 4 years, I will not be able to expand the settlements in Judea and Samaria, and to complete the demographic revolution in the land of Israel. I know the others will now try to work against this. Without this demographic revolution, there is no value to the talk about autonomy, because there is a danger that it will be turned into a Palestinian state. What is this talk about political settlements? I would have carried on autonomy talks for 10 years, and meanwhile, we would have reached 500,000 people in Judea and Samaria." With Shamir gone, progress would be possible, but who would be making this progress? The leadership which was pulled from the occupied territory were the ones making these proposals to Israel and advocating for a Palestinian state, while Arafat was stuck in Tunisia. Arafat was well aware of the attempts by literally everyone to sideline him, and began to be concerned that his leadership was being questioned. When Rabin deported Hamas activists to Lebanon, something which was illegal, talks were suspended. Arafat used this as an opportunity to begin negotiating with Israel in secret. Not even the Palestinian delegation to Washington knew. Direct Israel and PLO talks would slowly lead to the first Oslo Accord. Now, all of this was negotiated in Oslo with nearly zero U.S. involvement, but Clinton felt the need to stage a photo shoot on the White House lawn on September 13th. Oslo I, otherwise known as the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements, saw, among other things, the recognition of the PLO as legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people by Israel. Palestinians were given control of Gaza and Jericho, and more withdrawals would be done gradually over a period of 5 years, where other issues would be papered over at the end of this interim period. It also called for elections to be held. Later, among other agreements made between Rabin and Arafat, this would come to include Oslo II of 1995, which would establish areas A, B, and C. This explains how we came towards the current map of the West Bank, where it looked like a bunch of Palestinian islands in an Israeli sea. However, one agreement that was being overlooked here is the Cairo Accord of 1994, which sets the discussion on the final status negotiations between May 1996 and May 1999. It started the ticking clock for when an agreement ought to have been reached. It is clear from these negotiations, however, that they did not immediately address the Palestinians' concerns regarding the occupation and the settlements. In the West Bank, there were around 150,000 settlers, an increase from around 4,000 in 1977. It was also clear that this was a weaker starting position than that which was delineated by Ashrawi and Husseini. If negotiations did indeed get frozen in autonomy, as they had feared, this arrangement would cause a massive amount of trouble for Palestinians. Arafat and many of the members of the PLO had been operating in exile and made these decisions from Tunisia, far away from the realities on the ground that many Palestinians were dealing with in the occupied territories, and thus it is safe to say they never put an appropriate amount of thought into how this deal would affect them. Arafat had once again proven his ability to maneuver himself politically and was put into a position where now he had to deliver to the Palestinians a state from what Oslo I and II had created. Arafat, who had been leading the Palestinian national movement for decades, proved that his ability to stay in charge no matter what was miraculous. Rabin had proven himself willing to make concessions, but he was characteristically cautious in this regard, fearing backlash from his opponents. He had done what no Israeli leader had done before, and potentially could have contributed to a two-state solution. Palestinians consider Rabin a monster for his various crimes against them, but some Israelis recognize Rabin as a martyr to peace, and his death also being the death of the peace process. On October 5th of 1995, the Israeli Knesset ratified Oslo II. Rabin in his speech said the following in reference to the newly established Palestinian Authority. "We want this entity to be less than a state, that will manage independently the lives of Palestinians under its authority. The borders of the State of Israel at the time of the permanent solution will be beyond the lines that existed before the Six-Day War. We will not return to the lines of June 4th, 1967. Historically, Rabin had preferred a joint arrangement with Jordan, but this option was taken away from him by Jordan relinquishing its claim. In private letters, he had indicated that he had not supported a Palestinian state, and even in his debate with Yitzhak Shamir, he had made clear that he did not support a Palestinian state and instead opted for adopting Begin's autonomy plan. His aides, however, thought a state would be inevitable given the interim agreement. Despite this, Rabin was often portrayed by his opponents, and even his supporters, as supporting a two-state solution. After Shamir resigned from the leader of the Likud party, one Benjamin Netanyahu took his place. When Oslo II was signed, Netanyahu took this as an opportunity to compare Rabin to Neville Chamberlain. He, in fact, insisted that Rabin was worse than Neville Chamberlain. In rallies where effigies of Rabin were dressed as a Nazi SS officer, Netanyahu campaigned against the peace process. Many Israelis today attribute this atmosphere as leading towards the death of Rabin. Toward the end of October, in response to the killing of an Islamic Jihad leader, a bomb went off in Israel. Rabin reacted by joining Israelis in a peace rally in Tel Aviv, and after singing with the crowd, he approached his car to leave. Here, one Yigal Amir shot him, and Rabin died on November 4th, 1995. To many Israelis, this is where the peace process died, but this is not true. As mentioned before, Rabin was not that dedicated to a Palestinian state. He was also not that enthusiastic about negotiating with the Palestinians. He adopted a strategy of moving negotiations along the Palestinian and Syrian track at the same time, trying to pressure both into fearing that the other was making progress without them. As well, Syria was seen as being a bigger priority since it had an actual army. When Rabin died, he was succeeded by Shimon Peres, who was much more serious about negotiating with the Palestinians. As per the Cairo Accords, final status negotiations were to begin in May of 1996, and Peres was quick to prepare ahead of time. Peres delegated one Yossi Beilin to meet with then-deputy of Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, to create a broad outline for what an agreement would potentially look like. According to Beilin, the outline stipulated that Israel would recognize a demilitarized Palestinian state, Israel would annex a portion of the settlement and in exchange give Palestinians territory along the Gaza Strip, and no refugees would be allowed to return to their land, but would be allowed to enter into the new Palestinian state unabated. West Jerusalem would be Israel's, and East Jerusalem would be recognized as disputed territory in which an agreement would be made at a later time. The Palestinian capital would be in Abu Dis, a suburb of Jerusalem. This was only an outline, however, and if Clinton, Arafat, and Peres had all won their elections in 1996, this probably would be the plan that the three would work on together. Arafat would go on to win his election overwhelmingly. He won over 80% of the vote against DFLP's Samiha Khalil, who only won a little over 10%. Now, Hamas boycotted these elections, and Palestinians in the diaspora did not participate, despite being a substantial portion of the Palestinian population. Regardless, observers felt these elections were free and fair, and Arafat had secured a very powerful ruling mandate. Clinton would also go on to win in November of 1996. The Israeli elections were set to be held in May of 1996, and due to a series of miscalculations by Shimon Peres, Benjamin Netanyahu would be elected prime minister on the 29th of May, winning by just 0.5%. Peres's failure is most likely attributable to his insecurity in projecting Rabin's image as Mr. Security. He felt that projecting this image was necessary for an electoral victory. Thus, he decided to strike at Yahya Ayash, a bomb maker for Hamas. In response, Hamas launched a wave of attacks throughout February and March that killed 58 people over the span of 9 days. Perez was now in an even worse place to project an image of security, and was desperate to correct this. He phoned Yasser Arafat in order to ask him to do something about this, and Arafat responded by attacking Hamas. Perez gloated that he killed 20 of the Hamas leaders, arrested thousands of them. He did something that nobody else did. He shaved their beards. Clinton also attempted to shore up Perez's election chances by pledging $1 billion in aid. Both Clinton and Arafat wanted Perez to be in charge of negotiations, seeing him as the only viable option for their political goals. Despite these overtures, Perez was still not convinced that he could present himself as someone who could protect Israelis, and after a flare-up in Israeli-occupied southern Lebanon, Perez doomed his electoral chances. He decided to respond in a brutal attack on the UN Qana refugee camp that killed over 100 civilians. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, who were 20% of the population, decried Perez as a war criminal and refused to vote for him. And thus, when elections came, Netanyahu was able to eke out a half-a-point victory. The new election law made the election for prime minister separate from that of the parliament, so Labour had, at the same time, won the parliament. Everyone hated Netanyahu, and Clinton was extremely upset that Perez had lost. His press secretary would later recall that Netanyahu was one of the single most obnoxious individuals you're going to come into, just a liar and a cheat. He would open his mouth, and you would have no confidence that anything that came out of it was the truth. With Ehud Barak and Arafat, you were in the margin of error. I mean, these were two relatively honest guys who had the right motive. Clinton, for his part, maintained that the U.S. should not be very critical of Israel. In fact, he spoke out against Bush for being too hard on Israel in order to ensure that Rabin would win the election, despite the fact that that was the outcome that he felt he needed in order to create a peace deal. Later, he would learn from this experience and become more proactive in ensuring a more favorable outcome for him. For now, negotiations had to commence with Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud. So Oslo II stipulated that Israel would have to redeploy its troops from Palestinian territories in scheduled phases after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. One such redeployment was from Khalil. The Israelis under Perez postponed the implementation of this withdrawal until after the Israeli elections, which Perez then lost. Netanyahu decided that this redeployment should be renegotiated. Arafat expressed concern that this would set a bad precedent, and thus a deadlock ensued for a month. Negotiations wouldn't open again until October of 1996, and would only conclude in a new agreement on January 15, 1997. This agreement is what created the Khalil that we know today, where a small Israeli enclave lives in the city guarded by Israeli soldiers, and on whose behalf a system of checkpoints and exclusive roads are built. Netanyahu was also able to include a note for the record penned by Dennis Ross that pegged Israel's commitment to Oslo II on whether or not the Palestinians were reciprocating. If one side was not compliant to Oslo II, then this would mean negotiations could be stopped, which only really helped Netanyahu. Now, throughout this period, the Palestinians and Israelis came up short in terms of their compliance to Oslo II. The Palestinians had not formally revised aspects of their charter they agreed to, and did not do enough in the eyes of the Israelis to provide security. However, the Israeli infractions were typically much more numerous. They failed to prevent settlement construction, to follow through on promised redeployments, and did not release all the prisoners that it had promised to. In response to the renewed negotiations over Khalil, Secretary of State Warren Christopher and Dennis Ross stated their new understanding of these negotiations. Israel would be expected to further its redeployments in March of 1997 and finish sometime in mid-1998. Negotiations would resume in March of 1997 as well. The United States also accepted Netanyahu's principle of reciprocity. Bill Clinton had also begun to reshuffle his cabinet after the new agreement was put in place and brought on Madeleine Albright to be the new Secretary of State. Netanyahu once again set off a setback to peace when he supported the construction of 6,500 housing units for an Israeli settlement in an East Jerusalem neighborhood called Jabal Abu Ghanaim. Palestinians responded in peaceful protest, while Netanyahu reacted by closing Bethlehem. Arafat was pressured by Hamas to resort to arms in reaction, but Arafat instead met with Rabin's son and insisted that things remain peaceful. The Americans, in rhetoric, were against these settlements, but in practice, they vetoed a UN resolution against them. Negotiations and redeployment stalled until Albright decided to increase American involvement in August of 1997. After her first trip to Israel on September 10th, Netanyahu released the jailed head of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, at the request of the King of Jordan in order to prevent unrest over a botched assassination attempt against a Hamas member in Jordan. This release served to bolster the anti-negotiation factions in Palestine. Both Israel and Palestine's anti-negotiation camps began to gain steam, and thus Albright organized yet another meeting meeting in order to get Netanyahu to agree to some redeployments and final status negotiations. At the same time that Clinton was attempting to get Netanyahu to redeploy, a scandal had begun to brew. By early 1998, Bill Clinton would be charged with having sexual relations with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. As this scandal would slowly develop into impeachment proceedings and it would become known that William Clinton indeed did have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, negotiations would continue. The Americans proposed to Netanyahu a plan where the Palestinians would increase their performance on security, and Netanyahu would have to withdraw from 13.1% of the West Bank and Gaza. In May, Albright asked for Arafat and Netanyahu's response. Arafat said yes. Netanyahu said no. The Americans considered appealing to the Israeli public and pressuring Netanyahu, but they decided that it would be better to keep this quiet. By September of 1998, no progress had been made, and Clinton decided to host a summit in Wye River Plantation in Maryland in October. From October 15th to October 23rd, the American proposal was discussed. Unlike Carter, Clinton did not stay at the summit the entire time and often went off to fundraise for midterm elections. On the last 2 days, he pulled an all-nighter in order to bring about an agreement. Netanyahu attempted to leverage his agreement towards the release of one Jonathan Pollard, who had spied on the U.S. government, to which Clinton almost relented until his CIA director threatened to resign. On October 23rd, an agreement was reached. The Palestinians would do more for security and revise their national charter. Israel would release the promised amount of prisoners and withdraw as Palestinians carried out their side of the bargain. The implementation of Wye was stalled, however, by quarrels of compliance brought up by Netanyahu. As per Clinton's agreement, he would visit the Gaza Strip in December of 1998 after the Palestinians changed their charter, which they did. After Clinton went to Gaza, he now had to face his impeachment hearings. On December 19th, Congress sent 2 articles of impeachment to the Senate. Soon thereafter, new elections were called for by Netanyahu in Israel. The new election date was set for mid-May, which would conveniently be past the expiration date of the Oslo Accords. As May 4th came closer, Arafat began to become more and more agitated. He had spent years negotiating with Netanyahu, only for Netanyahu to once again pull a stalling tactic. Arafat was becoming increasingly unpopular for suppressing Hamas, and now it would seem the Palestinians, who had expected a state by May 4th, would see that it was all pointless. He began to say that he would unilaterally declare independence by May 4th. Netanyahu responded by saying he would annex Area C of the West Bank. Clinton felt that this would only serve to help Netanyahu win his election, and this time he was more proactive in ensuring that Netanyahu would lose. On October 26th, Clinton sent Arafat a letter that called the lack of implementation of Wye unfortunate, noted the seriousness in which Palestinians had committed themselves to security, and which spoke about American support for Palestinian self-determination. This convinced Arafat to back away from declaring independence. Next, Clinton would have to work on getting Netanyahu's opponent, Barak, elected. As governor of Arkansas, Clinton had to face election every 2 years, and at this point in time, he had won 2 campaigns for the presidency, so needless to say, he had a lot of experience in elections. His campaign staff, led by Stanley Greenberg, was hired by Ehud Barak to run his election. Barak was also heavily financed by Americans, so much so that he was found to have committed electoral malfeasance nearly a year later and subsequently had to pay a fine of nearly $3.2 million. For all his troubles, Clinton got his results on May 17th, when Barak had won 56% of the vote. Netanyahu decided to leave politics and never returned. He just sat down and stopped. Never held on to the prime minister position again. He would also not cause Israel to have 5 different elections in the span of 4 years, deciding that his political career was more of a punishment to the world than anything else. Clinton was ecstatic to see Barak win and described himself as eager as a kid with a new toy. Ehud Barak's career was made primarily in the military, and he became acquainted with President Clinton as the chief of general staff under Yitzhak Rabin, who Barak claimed was his mentor. His political career began relatively recently at that point in 1995. Clinton wanted to give Barak every opportunity to succeed, so he ensured that Barak would have 50 days to form his new coalition. On July 6th, he presented his government. The Americans saw Barak as their last chance for a deal, but the Palestinians were put off by Barak at the outset due to a variety of issues. First was Barak's victory speech, where he laid out his 4 red lines, being that Jerusalem would be united under Israeli sovereignty, that Israel would not return to pre-67 borders, that they would not allow a foreign army to control the border with Jordan, and that most of the settlement blocks would be annexed by Israel. He also proposed that any agreement that was made would have to be certified by a referendum. Barak also made no commitment to implementing the Wye River Agreement. Another thing which shook the confidence of the Palestinians was Barak's positions he gave to Shimon Peres and Yossi Bilan, both of whom were a huge part of bringing the Oslo Accords into being. Peres would be the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Bilan was the Justice Minister. This sidelining caused the Palestinians concern along with Barak's criticism of the Oslo Accords. Barak saw the Oslo Accords as fundamentally flawed. He wanted negotiations with the Palestinians to complete final status issues, and felt that the incrementalist approach was bad. In fact, Barak even opposed the implementation of the Wye River Accords, arguing that it would cost him too much political capital for a final status deal, where he would, in his mind, be able to bridge the gaps all at once. In order for a final status deal to be implemented, Barak felt that he needed a lot of political capital, and attempted to ashore his political capital up by forming the largest coalition that he could. Barak, due to his time in the military, had connections to both right-wing and left-wing elements of Israeli politics, and the coalition he created reflected this. His 75-member coalition, well above the 61 members he needed to rule, included the pro-settler party of the National Religious Party and the Israeli Ba'aliyah party, which represented newly arrived Russian Jews. In order to appease the NRP, he allowed settlements to continue being built, and appointed its leader, Yitzhak Levy, as a Minister of Housing and Construction. To the Palestinians, this was a major concern, since more settlements meant that as negotiations continued, facts on the ground would continuously change, and makes Barak's promise to annex settlement blocks apply to more and more territory. However, what really gave the Palestinians misgivings about Barak was his decision to focus on Syria first, and to delay the implementation of the Wye River Accords. The decision to focus on Syria first was heavily supported in the American camp by one Martin Indyk. His rationale for it was that a peace treaty with Syria would produce a peace treaty with Lebanon, would deal with the Hezbollah problem in southern Lebanon, and take the only remaining conventional army out of the conflict with Israel. We would have been in a much better position then to work the Israeli-Palestinian track in a situation where Arafat would have to get serious about doing a deal for fear of being left high and dry, and the Israelis would be in a better position in which to do a deal. Indyk, who made sure to emphasize that America would be supporting Israel in these negotiations, saying previously at an AIPAC conference that even-handedness is not in our lexicon. In order to focus on Syria first, he traveled to the Erez crossing in Gaza to meet with Arafat on July 11th in order to convince him to delay the implementation of Wye, which Arafat relented to. As the Israelis announced that they would pick up with Syria, where Peres had left off, the delay for the implementation of Wye wore off. Arafat again pressed for Barak to implement Wye on July 27th. Here he asked that Barak live up to his obligation to withdraw from 13% of the West Bank, release Palestinian prisoners, build the Palestinians a seaport, and to build a road to connect Gaza and Khalil. Barak asked Arafat for another 2-week delay for the implementation of Wye, and once again Arafat relented. This delaying of Israel's obligations made many Palestinians become more and more distrustful of Barak's intentions. As Mohammed Dahlan, the Gaza Palestinian Security Service chief, put it, "We understand it when we sign an agreement with the Labour Party and the Likud wants to change it. But not if the Likud signs an agreement and Labour wants to change it." The delay also caused concern in the Palestinian public, especially concerning prisoners, as mothers began marching for the release of their children. Arafat thus asked on August 23rd for Madeleine Albright to intervene. She arrived on September 2nd, and on September 4th, they announced what was called the Sharm Agreement, because it was signed at the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh, and its actual name is too long. It stipulated that the second withdrawal, stipulated under Oslo II, would now be split into 3 withdrawals to be done on September 5th, November 15th, and January 20th, so that Palestinians would gain control over 11% more of the West Bank. The third redeployment would be discussed at a later date. Sharm also promised the Palestinians FAPS by February 13th, 2000. FAPS being short for Framework Agreement for a Permanent Settlement. And on September 13th, they were promised a complete agreement for a permanent settlement. Once again, Arafat had agreed to have an agreement at a later time. Barak, who wanted to focus on Syria, now could do just that. He campaigned on ending the Israeli occupation in Lebanon, and he felt that he would need an agreement on Syria in order to do that. Now, the important thing to know about the Syria and Israel talks is that they failed. I'm not going to go over why or what happened at these discussions because this video, it's already too long. It's already too long, okay? So by March 28th in 2000, months had been spent on no deal. Hafez al-Assad would go on to die on June 10th, and his son, Bashar al-Assad, would be busy consolidating his power, and thus any negotiations with Syria were now completely out of the question. The Palestinian track, now being the only possible option, was thus open for pursuit. This doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of blocks and setbacks along the way. While Barak began preparing for the Syrian track, settlements began increasing at an alarming rate. The number of settlers from the day he took office to 2000 went from 177,000 to 203,000. The restrictions on movement at this point had proven to Palestinians that the negotiations were not bringing them any tangible benefits. On the 23rd of September, at the UN General Assembly, Arafat bemoaned, "The continuation of these settlement policies and practices severely diminishes the hope and expectations generated by the signing of the Sharm el-Sheikh Memorandum and destroys prospects for the final settlement negotiation." Arafat's inability to stop the settlements, while also continuing to negotiate, made him take big hits from his political opponents. The Americans understood that the settlements were a big issue, but did not pressure the Israelis on them. Feeling concerned over Barak's political situation and from backlash from the Jewish American and evangelical American communities, the Americans, as mentioned before, wanted to save Barak's political capital, which Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk were in favor of. Indyk claimed that the Palestinians never made an issue out of the settlements, but according to Mohammed Dahlan, they had complained about the settlements to the Americans constantly. Dahlan reflected, "Dennis Ross was enlightened about the danger of those settlements more than 2,000 times, but he moved nothing with President Clinton. The lack of progress allowed opponents of the negotiations to gain notoriety. PIJ and Hamas would release scathing critiques of Arafat's renegotiations. Arafat's attempts to disrupt them with his CIA and Israeli-backed PSS were only moderately successful concerning PIJ and mostly a failure concerning Hamas. Hamas resorted to using pipe bombs to derail the FAPS talks, threatening escalation should Barak continue to create more settlements." By April 2000, Arafat, who was elected with over 80% of the vote, now had an approval rating of 34%, and Hamas had an approval rating of 15%, up from 10%. In this environment, breaking promises with Arafat bolstered his opponents in Hamas. Barak had honored the commitments concerning the first chunk of the second redeployment on September 5th, but come November 15th, Barak was now asking that instead of leaving the previously agreed-upon territory, that he leave only a mostly unpopulated bit of desert. Arafat refused this, pointing out that this would not improve anyone in Palestine's livelihoods. Ross dismissed Arafat's concerns, believing that it did not matter if Israel did not live up to its interim obligations, so long as final status issues would be later discussed. To the Palestinians, this made no sense, because anything that they had already under their control before final status agreements commenced would be assured to be theirs in a Palestinian state. Everything else might potentially be stolen by Israel. The second chunk of the second redeployment would be delayed by 2 months until January 6th of 2000, when Arafat once again relented to the Israelis and allowed them to withdraw from only remote desert areas. Barak promised Arafat he would have more control over the third chunk of the second redeployment, but when a hiccup occurred in the Syria talks due to a leak, Barak once again asked Arafat for another postponement. He even went so far to advocate for scrapping the third redeployment entirely, saying, "We'll talk about it during the negotiations on the permanent status." As the Oslo II, Sharm renegotiation was falling apart, the FAPS began to start lacking as well. Upon learning about FAPS, Arafat quickly introduced his Minister of Culture and Information, Yasser Abed Rabo, to FAPS. The Israelis were not so good with FAPS, and only introduced their guy, Oded Iran, to it in November. During the FAPS meetings, the Palestinians tried to get Barak to accept Resolution 242 as applicable to the occupied territories, since his Foreign Affairs spokesman put it, "Since Barak has said that he will not withdraw to 1967 boundaries and will keep most Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in territorial blocks under Israeli sovereignty, he clearly does not view Resolution 242 as applicable to all the West Bank." Palestinians at around the same time had begun to take more action at beefing up their legal team. Mahmoud Abbas was one of the only people on the Palestinian team with a law degree, and he had not even practiced as an attorney. The Palestinians had mostly abruptly ended their studies in university to join the Palestinian cause, and thus they were woefully underprepared for these negotiations and had to call in the help of professional lawyers. They couldn't keep showing up to negotiations with scribbled up pieces of paper in the face of Israel's laptops. So they created the NSU, the Negotiation Support Unit, a team of Ivy Leaguers to help prepare them for FAPs and CAPs. This team would find itself unable to discuss many of the final status issues at the discouragement of Israel and the US, who at this point in time were still convinced they could focus on Syria. Negotiations would soon break down over the issue of the third chunk of the second redeployment. On January 17th, Arafat quietly pressed Barak to live up to his promise, and in addition to make up for his infractions by adding the critical villages of Abu Dis, Azariya, and Ram to the withdrawal. Barak at first agreed until Likud politicians Ehud Olmert and Ariel Sharon campaigned against this. They argued that giving the Palestinians Abu Dis now would mean they wouldn't be able to force Palestinians to make that their capital instead of East Jerusalem. So, Barak decided that he would instead link the fulfillment of the third chunk to the implementation of the FAPs, which was due on February 13th, well beyond the January 20th deadline, which was also not even close to being done due to Israeli distraction with Syria. On January 20th, Arafat took his complaint to Clinton, who made more promises of comprehensive peace and ignored him. On February 4th, when Barak presented Arafat a map of the redeployments without Abu Dis, Arafat finally stopped making concessions to the Israelis and suspended negotiations until Barak lived up to his word. Polls in Israel at the time suggested that Israelis would be willing to give up these neighborhoods for peace, so the Palestinians stood their ground on this issue. Arafat expressed that he would declare independence on September 13th, with or without an agreement, and Israel's military establishment began to sweat. The IDF knew that it had the upper hand, but the thought of Arafat potentially using the newly CIA-trained PSS on them instead of on other Palestinians gave them pause for concern. Many counseled Barak against antagonizing the Palestinians and to agree to live up to his obligations. Barak committed to returning 2 of the villages on April 23rd and another on May 23rd, as well as recommitting to the third redeployment on June 23rd. On March 8th, Arafat agreed to return to FAPs. As you would probably guess, this agreement wouldn't be fully implemented. Pro-settler Knesset members complained about the inclusion of the village of Anata, which they claimed should be retained since it was important in Jewish scripture, being part of the third chunk of the second redeployment, and Barak caved in and disincluded it. He also fell short of the prisoners that he was supposed to release. This was on March 20th. And on March 28th, the Syria track ended, and now Barak would begin to take FAPs seriously. On April 11th, Barak met with Clinton and showed him his proposal for a final settlement. Jerusalem would be postponed for another later discussion, and Israel would annex or lease out a third of the West Bank. No American pointed out that this would be unacceptable to the Palestinians, but within Barak's inner circle, this plan was criticized by Shlomo ben Ami, who said of it that he was proud of the fact that his map would leave Israel with about a third of the territory. If I remember right, he gave the Palestinians only 66% of the land. Ehud was convinced this was extremely logical. He had a kind of patronizing, wishful thinking, naive approach, telling me enthusiastically, "Look, this is a state. To all intents and purposes, it looks like a state." Another setback would appear concerning Abu Dis. It was supposed to be returned, as mentioned, on April 23rd. But thanks to the ultra-Orthodox Shas party demanding that its religious schools be funded, the coalition became divided against itself. Barak asked Arafat for yet another delay till May 1st, and Arafat once again relented. As May 1st came, the NRP and Israeli Ba'aliyah threatened to leave the coalition if they gave the Palestinians Abu Dis. Shas, seeing an opportunity to bend Barak's arm, doubled down on the school demands, and the Knesset went into recess, delaying the transfer of Abu Dis until May 15th. FAPs, however, kept on pumping out loads of progress. On May 4th, in the city of Eilat, the Palestinians pressed to have final status issues to finally be discussed. The Israelis relented and presented the Palestinians a map where 20% of the West Bank would be annexed and 14% would be continued to be occupied by Israel. The Palestinians stormed out of the room, cursing in Arabic, English, and since Mohammed Dahlan was there too, in Hebrew. Dennis Ross felt insulted by this reaction. Palestinians at this point were only willing to allow for 4% annexation of the West Bank, provided that they were given land in exchange on a 1-to-1 ratio. On May 12th to May 15th, the Israelis and Palestinians met in Harpsund, Sweden, in an attempt to finish their FAPs. The new Israeli proposal was that Palestinians would only get 76.6% of the West Bank, the other 10% would be under another 20 years of occupation, and the remaining 13% would be annexed. The Israelis refused any territory swaps proposed by the Palestinians. The Palestinians, who had already forsworn the rest of historic Palestine, a difficult concession for many negotiators who themselves were refugees, were unhappy with only receiving 77% of what was 22% of their territory. Speaking about refugees, the Israelis were only willing to allow 10 to 15,000 to return to their homes, as part of a family reunification scheme that didn't recognize any blame whatsoever on Israel's part for making them refugees in the first place. Jerusalem was not discussed. Negotiations ended when a leak brought this to light, and in Palestine the reaction was extremely negative. May 15th is when Palestinians remember the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and upon hearing the details of the Harpsund talks, people became agitated. When demonstrators confronted Israeli occupying troops with Molotov cocktails on a hilltop in the village of El Bira, the Israeli forces responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammo. Palestinian police were forced with a dilemma. Should they back the Israeli troops or the Palestinian street? They chose to back the Palestinians, and they exchanged fire with Israeli troops. By the end of the May demonstrations, 6 Palestinians were killed. 1,500 were injured, and no Israeli had died. The only Israelis who were injured were IDF soldiers shot at by the Palestinian police. Barak used this incident to put the village transfer on hold. Negotiations for Camp David II, which would soon be announced, were now less than 2 months away, and as demonstrated, the Palestinians and the Israelis were extremely far apart in what they thought would be a final settlement. The public anger at the continued delays in implementation of Oslo II was palpable, and outrage at what could potentially just be the occupation in another form, or what Shlomo Ben Ami called a beefed-up Ilan plan, was beginning to crop up. Discussions up until this point had also not touched upon many of the final status issues at all, and what was discussed there was no consensus on. Regardless, the peace process continued. On May 24th, Israel, after being battered by Hezbollah, withdrew from southern Lebanon, and finally, Arafat had begun to look the most stupid he had ever looked to the Palestinian public. His approval rating in April had gone to 34%, and now people were in the streets saying, "Lebanon today, Palestine tomorrow." Clinton official Tony Verstendig said that Palestinians were now thinking,
Wait a minute. Hezbollah got everything they wanted without negotiating an inch, and we don't have the June 4th, 1967 borders? We have 80% of a West Bank that is carved up?
people won't just allow themselves to live under a military occupation out of the kindness of their heart. And a belief emerged that the negotiations, which leaks showed were not going to even result in a contiguous state, let alone give Palestinians the entirety of the occupied territories, were useless. So when Barak once again announced he would not fulfill his commitment for the third redeployment due on June 23rd, and instead insisted that everything be solved in the summit, Arafat became very worried for his credibility. At another meeting to discuss FAPs, when Barak refused to comply with his obligations, Arafat ordered his representatives only to discuss the generics. Arafat was invited to Washington on the 15th of June, and the day before, Barak once again announced he would not do the third redeployment and insisted that releasing 3 out of the 250 prisoners he was supposed to was good enough. Saeb Erekat responded, "All we want from Israel is to implement the agreements. They can keep their goodwill gestures for themselves." When Arafat arrived, Clinton tried to convince him to engage in a summit. Arafat told Clinton about his grievances with Barak and about his idea for what a settlement would look like.
Mr. President, no negotiations can succeed without total adherence to the agreements that have already concluded. In these circumstances, what the Israelis want to negotiate with me in the framework of the permanent status isn't in accordance with the agreements. That's bad faith on their part.
Arafat then expressed his support for Resolution 242 as being the basis of the discussions, and that Jerusalem would be the capital of both states and could potentially be an open city. On refugees, Arafat said,
On the refugee issue, yes, there is Resolution 194, but we have to be able to find a happy medium between the Israelis' demographic worries and our own concerns.
Arafat asked Clinton for one last thing before agreeing to this summit.
I think that Barack has decided to put us in the position of the guilty party, and I need your promise that wherever we go with the negotiations, you will not shift the blame for failure onto us and won't back us into a corner.
To which Clinton said, I promise you that under no circumstances will I place the blame for failure on you. With that, Camp David II was on. But as with everything in this story, things were not very cheery. The Palestinians clearly felt they were being walked into a trap, where any demand they would make would be ignored, and any demand Israel would make would be forced onto them. When Barak announced he was going to enter into negotiations, his government collapsed. The National Religious Party and the Yisrael Ba'aliyah bolted. An article at the time reported, Barak is traveling to the summit defeated and alone, crowed the opposition Likud party in announcing a rally against the peace talks. I regret that the person who wanted to be the prime minister of everyone became, in just 1 year, the prime minister of almost no one, except maybe himself. Ariel Sharon, the Likud leader, taunted Barak in parliament. Palestinians were now concerned about whether or not Barak could even make a decision. And do not even get me started with the Americans. I've been pretty descriptive about what the Palestinians and Israelis have been doing this entire time, but I realize now is a perfect time to discuss the absolute chaos that was the Americans. Firstly, the Americans had members of their team, like Martin Indyk, who openly scoffed at the idea of being even-handed in facilitation, and people like Dennis Ross, who the Palestinians rightly viewed as being too biased towards Israel. Ross, for example, would advocate that the U.S. Embassy be moved to Jerusalem before any settlement was achieved, which is something that many liberals today lambast Trump for doing. What didn't make things any better was the rivalry between the State Department officials and the National Security Council officials, which was heralded by the intense dislike that Secretary Madeleine Albright had for National Security Council head Sandy Berger. Both often vied for the president's attention and a greater role in these negotiations. The most vulnerable member of the American team was unfortunately Bill Clinton. Just surviving a scandal in which he had publicly lied to America in a way that had embarrassed his wife, Clinton was dead set on improving his legacy and her political career. And unfortunately for her, Hillary was dealing with a lot of flack concerning the issue of Palestine, which her political opponents used to criticize her, forcing the White House to release a statement which said that her views weren't those of the president. Things kept moving though, and on July 11th, Camp David began. Camp David is a little presidential retreat in Maryland. It was thought that here, separated from the contact of the rest of the world, that Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, and Ehud Barak would come to a deal. They wanted to create a total media blackout. No cameras and no recording devices were allowed. In the town of Emmitsburg, Maryland, both sides' teams of lawyers were to hash out the softer issues and to be ready to give legal advice to their respective teams in Camp David. Now, despite both sides agreeing to not break the rules concerning media silence, they both tried to do so. The Palestinians, despite wanting to, did not have the resources to do it. The Israelis, on the other hand, did. Ehud Barak brought with him encrypted communications equipment that allowed him to stay in contact with his PR team. Palestinian spokesmen who had no idea about what was going on in Camp David found that somehow Israeli journalists knew more about what was going on than they did. On the afternoon of the first day, all the negotiators had a meeting where it was made clear that Clinton would be leaving in the middle of the summit on July 19th for a G8 summit in Japan. If they made a deal before then, Clinton would then give them all a buttload of financial aid. In a separate meeting with Clinton, Arafat laid out his red lines. Israel had to recognize the right of return in principle, and from there they would negotiate practical details, keeping Israel's demographic makeup in mind. West Jerusalem was Israel's. East Jerusalem, including the Haram al-Sharif, was Palestine's. Clinton refused this and insisted that the Israelis maintain sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif, in exchange for no occupation of the Jordan Valley. Arafat opposed this. Both the Israelis and Palestinians would spend the beginning of the summit waiting for the Americans to present a negotiating draft, something which they did during the first Camp David summit. But unlike Carter, Clinton was not prepared for what exactly he wanted to present to both sides. As mentioned earlier, many of the core issues were not heavily discussed during FAPS, and thus the Americans did not have a firm idea of what each side's true needs and red lines were. Nabil Shath recounted a conversation he had with a member of the American team, Aaron, David, and Miller, about what the expectations were about what Palestinians would accept. What percentage do you think the Palestinians will settle with in a territorial issue? And he, Aaron David Miller, said, 70%? I said, Aaron, you're miserably misinformed. Nothing less than 100%, plus or minus a few percentages for a swap on a one-to-one basis. This divide between what Palestinians understood as their needs and what American thought were their needs was indeed a shocking starting point in what was supposed to be a final status negotiation. Miller would later admit that the Americans were not very well prepared for this summit. Clinton delegated parts of the draft-making process to his team so he could attend an NAACP meeting in Baltimore. Clinton's team virtually copied what was presented at Harpsund, which both Arafat and Barak had rejected. Now, when this draft was finished, Dennis Ross decided that the best move to demonstrate his chops as a good faith negotiator was to show the drafts to the Israelis first without Palestinian input. Barak rejected it, and thus the Americans set about making a second draft. Barak rejected language concerning Jerusalem that suggested it might be divided, and the language concerning the use of Resolution 242 as a basis. He demanded that the line saying that FAPS is based upon and will lead to the implementation of Resolution 242 be revised so that it says instead that FAPS is the basis for the implementation of Resolution 242. This change would allow Barak to say he fulfilled Resolution 242 without a settlement based on it. Barak would also reject this second draft. When it was shown to the Palestinians, they saw Ross's handwriting, editing out bits concerning Jerusalem and Resolution 242, and on July 14th at 2:30 a.m. they formally rejected it. Ross would go on to admit that he had shown the draft to the Israelis first, and from then on, all proposals would be given orally. Negotiations stalled, and the Americans withdrew their draft. The Palestinians suggested that they all break off into teams of 3 to negotiate over borders and security, Jerusalem, and refugees, which Clinton accepted. In the Jerusalem discussions, the Palestinians were willing to accept compromises concerning settlements, but only if the Israelis recognized the principles of Resolution 242, 338, and 194. They wanted to have sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif and all the Arab parts of Jerusalem. Since this was discussed at earlier negotiations, this was thought of as a given. The border meeting would be worse. On July 16th, the Israelis presented the first and only map of the entire summit, which was based on the Harpsund map. As mentioned, it annexed 14% of the West Bank, placed 10% under indefinite occupation, and the portions that were given for a Palestinian state would be split by strips that would be annexed to Israel, making the territory uncontiguous. They had already rejected this proposal and were angry to see it again. Clinton told Abu Ala, giving him a blank map, to draw onto it a counter-proposal then and there, to which Abu Ala demanded a commitment for negotiations to be based on 1967 borders. Clinton flipped out, saying, "Sir, I know you'd like the whole map to be yellow, but that's not possible. This isn't the Security Council here. This isn't the UN General Assembly. If you want to give a lecture, go over there and don't make me waste my time. I'm the President of the United States. I'm ready to pack my bags and leave." According to Gilead Share, Clinton was shouting. He dramatically exited the cabin, and as Madeleine Albright described, chose to get drenched in the rain. It was either get wet or forfeit the drama of our exit, so he went and got drenched. Now this sounds really dumb in hindsight, especially the way Albright put it, but according to Israeli negotiator Gilead Share, this had a very negative effect on Abu Ala, and the Palestinians' trust in the Americans. He said,
"Abu Ala, as a sheet, left the room, very hurt. He lost all faith then in the honest, unbiased brokers of the United States."
This, compounded with the fact that Barak was avoiding talking to Arafat in order to put him under pressure, caused a lot of paranoia in the Palestinians. The refugee meetings also went badly. They were headed by Mahmoud Abbas and Nabil Shaf, both refugees from the town of Safed, and were headed by Dan Meritor. To Dan Meritor, the Palestinians never owned Palestine, and to him, and many Israelis, the idea that Israel was in any way responsible for Palestinians becoming refugees was equivalent to admitting that Israel shouldn't exist. I will get into the subject of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in a later video, but regardless, the Palestinian negotiators were not advocating for a full right of return in these meetings. Instead, they advocated for the right to be recognized in principle, and they would later take into account Israel's interests in terms of demographics. Barak and Arafat were not talking, since Barak was intentionally avoiding Arafat. Gamal Halal called him a runaway bride, and said that Barak locked himself up in the room. He didn't have one single gathering with Arafat except for tea, and the condition to not discuss things of substance. This was obviously going nowhere. So on July 17th, Clinton asked Arafat and Barak to send a team of 2 negotiators to speak with one another in secret to talk about every topic at hand. Ben Ami, Sher, Dahlan, and Arafat all were locked in a room and would continue to discuss with the condition that an agreement reached would be non-binding. The Israelis proposed that, for Jerusalem, that the outer envelope of Arab neighborhoods in the city would be under Palestinian sovereignty. The inner envelope would be under functional autonomy, the old city under a special regime, and the Temple Mount under a perpetual Palestinian trusteeship. The Israelis would also slightly whittle down the amount of territory they would annex from 14% to 12%. However, there were still breaks in territorial contiguity. The Palestinians suggested that they get compensation for the damages caused by the occupation. Shlomo Ben Ami flipped out. While our heroes were negotiating the deal of the century, Ariel Sharon was leading 150,000 protesters in Tel Aviv to oppose the negotiations. Clinton also had to leave negotiations once again in order to put out a fire over claims that Hillary had previously used anti-Semitic slurs. Clinton, in an interview with Mortimer Zuckerman's New York Daily News, said, "She can't tell an ethnic joke. It's not in her." Arafat made Clinton an offer. If there was a fair solution to the refugee issue, if there was no Israeli presence on the Jordanian border, and if Palestinians had sovereignty over East Jerusalem minus Jewish neighborhoods, Arafat would accept any territorial arrangement to Clinton's discretion. Clinton was then going to try and propose either an 8 or 9% annexation of the West Bank with a return of only 1%. Given the movement on the issues that had just occurred, the Israelis spent the entire afternoon and evening of July 17th to discuss what they might be willing to give up. They were discussing this way past midnight when Barak started to choke on a peanut. He almost died, then and there. Anyway, Clinton presented Barak this deal, and Barak pussyfooted around it, to which Clinton responded in frustrated and cited the negotiations he had with Syria. "I can't go see Arafat with a retrenchment. You can sell it. There is no way I can. This is not real. This is not serious. I went to Shepherdstown and was told nothing by you for 4 days. I went to Geneva and felt like a Why say this, man? I felt like a wooden Indian doing your bidding. I will not let it happen here." Clinton suggested that they end the summit or broker a limited agreement since he was about to leave for Japan. However, both of them wanted everything to be solved in one big summit, and opted not to do that. Barak then laid out to Clinton his plan, which is that 9% of the West Bank would be annexed, 1% would be added to Gaza, 15 to 20% of the West Bank on the border of Jordan would continue to be under occupation for 12 years, and refugee issues would be solved later. Most crucially, Palestinians would only get custodianship over the Haram al-Sharif and not sovereignty. Clinton went to present this to Arafat, but not as Barak's plan. Instead, he presented it as America's plan. In the middle of Clinton's presentation, Arafat said,
"These are Israelis' ideas. I received them unofficially from the Israeli delegation 2 hours ago."
Arafat rejected this plan, and when Barak heard of this rejection, he took back his commitment to it as well. Clinton decided that on the Haram al-Sharif, he would present to the Palestinians a new idea. The UN Security Council would bestow a diplomatic status on Palestinians for the Haram, while Israelis would still have sovereignty over it. Before Clinton proposed this to Arafat, he met Dahlan at the Camp David cafeteria. In this chance meeting, Clinton told Dahlan of this plan, which Dahlan begged Clinton not to show Arafat, because Arafat would reject it. Clinton tried very hard in a private meeting to get Arafat to accept it. In what was called bullying by Clinton's advisor, Joe Lockhart, Clinton sat Arafat down, held onto his arms, and placed his forehead onto Arafat's. Arafat agreed to consider Clinton's proposal. Sometime after midnight on July 19th, the Palestinians gave their response, which was to ask for clarifications. While the State Department team, headed by Ross and Albright, was asleep, the U.S. switched who they would rely on in these negotiations, leaning onto the National Security Council team. This caused some shouting matches when the state team woke up to find that they conducted a policy planning meeting with the Palestinians without them. In the morning, the Palestinians informed the president that they did not accept his ideas concerning Jerusalem. Clinton delayed the G8 trip in order to keep pressuring the Palestinians on this issue. He offered them billions of dollars in financial aid, which they felt cheapened by. Clinton spent the rest of the day trying to get Arafat to accept his ideas, threatening to wash his hands of the peace efforts if he did not accept. Arafat was opposed to Clinton portraying him as foiling the peace process over his refusal to accept Israeli sovereignty over the Haram. Arafat replied that,
"The Palestinian leader who will give up Jerusalem has not yet been born. Do not look to me to legitimize the occupation. Of course, it can continue longer, but it cannot last forever. No one can continue to indefinitely impose domination by military force. Look at South Africa. Our people will not accept less than their rights as stated by international resolutions and international legality."
Arafat's unwilling to move on the Haram al-Sharif was motivated by a lot of things. Partly, he didn't believe that the Temple Mount was in the same location, believing it to be in Nablus instead. But more importantly, he thought that if he gave up the Haram, he would be assassinated. When Albright pushed Arafat on the Haram, Arafat replied, "The next time you see me will be when you are walking behind my coffin." Arafat was unwilling to make a decision on the third holiest site in Islam without the backing of the 61 states in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He did not believe that he could move individually on this issue. American Ambassador Ned Walker concurred.
There was no way in hell that Arafat could ever have reached an agreement on Jerusalem. He doesn't represent the Islamic world. He had to have the support of other Arab countries or Islamic countries in order to do so. Otherwise, he would have been charged with having sold Islam out the window. There would have been a fatwa on his head the next day. It has nothing to do with personal weakness. It was an absolute fact. He would have been assassinated.
The Americans didn't take Arafat's fears seriously, asking their ambassadors to the Arab world to get some Arab states to pressure Arafat into accepting this deal, in an attempt to prove Arafat wrong. When Clinton asked Mubarak, the president of Egypt, to pressure Arafat, in an interaction that made me laugh out loud while reading, Mubarak recalled this was his response. "I was stunned. I get a call from the President of the United States who tells me I've got to call Arafat and push him to take a compromise on Jerusalem. I asked him, well, what is the background? What are the terms? And the President said, I can't tell you because I pledged not to reveal the details of the negotiations in advance. So I said, thank you, Mr. President. There is nothing I can do for you." Clinton tried this with Saudi Arabia, and just like with Egypt, he wasn't willing to tell them the compromise that he was trying to force upon Arafat. The Saudis responded the same way, except to emphasize that they didn't accept Palestinians' right to act unilaterally on Jerusalem. From here, Barack and Clinton gave up on the summit. The Palestinians and the Israelis began to pack their bags, but Clinton would attempt to make them all stay. Clinton had gotten Barack to agree to stay on the condition that Clinton continued to negotiate on the basis they had left off on. Clinton then told Arafat that Barack was willing to stay, but conveniently did not tell Arafat about Barack's condition. Arafat and Barack would stay at Camp David, while Clinton finally went off to his G8 summit. Now, with Clinton gone, Barack and Arafat would find that they were both told different things, and Barack was unwilling to renegotiate with Arafat unless he accepted Israeli sovereignty over the Haram as the basis of discussion. Barack mostly kept himself out of negotiations during Clinton's absence. In fact, without Clinton there, everyone sort of just did nothing. Albright organized a movie night where they all sat in Clinton's private movie theater to watch action movies. Barack went to visit Gettysburg. The Palestinians, who wanted to bring stuff home for their families, asked if they could go shopping at the mall. Now, I sort of lied. Not everyone just did nothing, but nothing of substance was discussed without Clinton. On July 23rd in the evening, Clinton returned to Camp David. Barack had retracted his willingness to allow Palestinians sovereignty over the Muslim and Christian. The evening Clinton got back, he set about trying to begin progress on other issues which had been barely discussed, one of which was security. The Israelis demanded that they have 3 early warning stations, 3 years to evacuate settlements, 5 IDF supply bases in the Jordan Valley, inspection oversight over border crossings between Egypt and Jordan, control over Palestinian airspace, including civilian flyover, and among other things, they asked for a demilitarized Palestinian state. The Palestinians instead suggested a compromise where international troops, which would include Americans, would be placed on the Jordanian border. The Israelis rejected this. Everyone went to sleep at 6 a.m. on July 24th and awoke the next day at 11 a.m. to discuss the refugees again. The Palestinians gave what was their usual proposal. The Israelis said that they didn't have any responsibility over the Palestinian refugees because of the exodus of Mizrahi Jews from other Arab states. But this was dumb, since Palestinians weren't responsible for what other countries did, and they did not benefit from that in any way at all. They next talked about territory. Palestinians wanted land swaps being 1-to-1, while Israelis opted for land swaps of 1-to-6, or 7, or 8, etc. Then they went back to Jerusalem. Clinton decided to offer Arafat a presidential palace that was exclusively his in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem if he accepted Israeli sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif. For Arafat, this was a very stupid offer, and he said he didn't want to sell out the Haram in exchange for a levitation chamber. His concerns of not being supported by the Islamic world still stood. He asked Clinton, "So you want to come to my funeral?" Clinton had made zero progress to indicate that they would support such a silly idea. From 10 p.m. on July 24th to after midnight on July 25th, Clinton summoned Ben Ami and Arafat for the final Camp David session. Clinton offered the same thing concerning the Haram once again. The UN Security Council and Morocco, which headed the OIC, would give the Palestinians sovereign custody over the Haram, while Israelis would have residual sovereignty over the Haram, which would allow them to claim the land beneath it. He threw in the palace for Arafat again. Clinton also included that the Muslim and Christian quarters would be a part of this deal. But Barak had at this point still had retracted that offer. The Palestinians once again refused this deal. As Halal put it, what the Palestinians were offered, no Arab leaders could accept. The Palestinians would go on to ask that negotiations continue. The Palestinian team all gathered to console Arafat, who was teary-eyed at this point, for having not caved in to Clinton. And with that, Camp David II was over. The fallout of Camp David II in the West and in Israel pretty neatly put all of the blame for the failure of the summit on Arafat. Barak was extremely prepared to begin telling everyone this version of the story. As Dan Meritor tried to sell things, once again the Arabs blew it. Barak would argue later on that the entire summit was part of a tactic on the part of Arafat to create a state where Arabs and Jews were equal in an attempt to change the demographics of the state. As he later said, their game plan is to establish a Palestinian state while always leaving an opening for further legitimate demands down the road. They will exploit the tolerance and democracy of Israel, first to turn it into a state for all of its citizens, as demanded by the extreme nationalist wing of Israel's Arabs and extremist left-wing Jewish Israelis. Then they will push for a binational state, and then demography and attrition will lead to a state with a Muslim majority and a Jewish minority. This would not necessarily involve kicking out all of the Jews, but it would mean the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. This, I believe, is their vision. To Barak, Arafat's willingness to lie was a product of Palestinian culture. As he would say, they are products of a culture in which to tell a lie creates no dissonance. They don't suffer from the problem of telling lies that exists in Judeo-Christian culture. Truth is seen as an irrelevant category. Arafat, for his part, did almost nothing to combat this, believing that there was never any way that the American or Western press wouldn't automatically side with Israel. The Palestinians as a whole still wanted to continue negotiations. Many of Arafat's rivals, such as Marwan Barghouti, did not oppose continuing negotiations at all. This was unfortunate for Barak, since, according to Yossi Bailin, his intent was to freeze the situation that had been created at the end of the Camp David summit, because he felt that the support he was getting from the peace camp in Israel made him think that reopening the negotiations would expose him to new Palestinian ideas, which he would be unable to accept. Hamas took this as an opportunity to offer Israel a ceasefire if it withdrew from the occupied territories. and also, as the Palestinians continued to get blamed, took another opportunity to advocate that the failure of Camp David II only vindicated their position that force was the only way for Palestinians to get their rights. Barak's blame game had the unexpected, but foreseeable, side effect of making him look like an idiot in Israel. He gave such a generous offer to Arafat, and look where that got him. He made himself look like a sucker, and undermined his own political position. He barely survived no confidence votes, his foreign minister resigned, and they began to propose that new elections be held. The Americans were completely spent at this point, and were very upset that Arafat couldn't be pressured. Now, this doesn't mean that negotiations ended. In fact, without American facilitation, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators kept on negotiating, with little break from Camp David II. On July 31st, less than a week after the summit failed, Saab Erekat and Gilead Sher began speaking with Egyptian mediation. Arafat had approved of these back channels, and on August 10th wrote to Clinton asking him to convene another summit. Dennis Ross responded to that letter negatively, saying that, he sent a letter to me saying, "Let's hold another summit." Like, well, fuck you. You know, we just shot our wad. Many Americans would later regret this stance taken by Ross. Ned Walker would go on to say of it,
That was stupid. Absolutely stupid on the part of anybody that made that kind of statement. Arafat had no way he would accept what they were offering on Jerusalem.
On August 29th, Mubarak arranged a meeting and presented the Israelis and Palestinians their working document, which addressed all of the issues. To this day, the Egyptians argue that the Americans stole these ideas and presented them as the Clinton parameters. 94% of the West Bank would be Palestinian and 1% would be added to Gaza. With a somewhat more solid basis, the Israelis and the Palestinians began pushing for a summit and American involvement, but there was no reply. Ben Ami recalled, "We were really waiting for the Americans to work out a package that would be presented to both sides. In this period, I personally pressured the Americans to work the collective memory that was created at Camp David into a document." Gilead Sher would go on to express confusion and dismay that the Americans delayed their presentation of the Clinton parameters.
Ask them, the Americans, because they were ready, and the packaging was ready toward the first week of September. We had numerous meetings between Camp David II and the beginning of the UN General Assembly in September. The package deal was ready. We discussed it with the details. I don't know why they were reluctant to put them on the table.
It was suggested that these ideas be presented at the UN General Assembly in September, where everyone would see each other, to which Barak responded that if Clinton and Arafat made an agreement, he would build a Jerusalem stronger and greater than ever, with a Jewish majority, a Jerusalem that will gain recognition by the whole world as the capital of Israel. And, if that happens, no struggle will be more exhilarating to wage on the streets at the junctions. Barak was still bitter about Camp David, and this was evident at the UN General Assembly when he and Arafat got into an elevator together. Barak refused to look at him. Arafat would sarcastically ask his wife,
"Who is this guy next to you?"
It was brutally awkward. Arafat proposed at the UN General Assembly that the Haram sovereignty would be given to the OIC, then chaired by the King of Morocco. The Americans and Israelis refused because the OIC included states that they called sponsors of terror. With that, September 13th was coming up. Arafat had indicated that he would declare independence here without an agreement, but without any support internationally, the day came and went without any hullabaloo. In order to get Arafat and Barak talking again, it required intervention, and with the Americans doing nothing, it was on the shoulders of Jewish-American billionaire Daniel Abraham to act in the name of peace. He made his billions selling the fat-loss diet program called Slim Fast. Anyway, Abraham pressured Barak to speak with Arafat at a dinner. At Barak's house, they smiled and walked arm in arm, but Arafat was not there just to mend his relationship with Barak. He was there with a warning. Ariel Sharon had announced that he would be planning a provocative visit to the Haram al-Sharif, and Arafat tried to warn Barak to stop him. Arafat believed that this would cause violence to spring out. He was informed by his CIA-trained PSS head in the West Bank, Jibril Rajoub, that this visit by Sharon would cause an outbreak of violence. Ultimately, Barak didn't do anything, but it's hard to imagine what he could do. On September 28th, Sharon made his visit to the Haram. The intense discussions over the Haram were common knowledge to the Palestinians, and Sharon, being responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres, was an especially hated figure for Palestinians. Sharon would later say his purpose for going was to actualize Israel's sovereignty over the Temple Mount. However, this would not be the cause of the Second Intifada to begin. It did provoke some demonstrations against his visit, where the IDF responded to people throwing rocks by killing 4 people and injuring 200. Incensed at the IDF's use of live ammunition on a crowd of unarmed people, things would spiral into the Second Intifada. The violence spurred an emergency summit on October 16th, and by the end of October, 100 Palestinians were killed by Israel, including 29 children, whereas 10 were Israelis, 4 of them being soldiers. Still, the Americans did not present anything, fully consumed by their election season. On December 9th, Barak threw another monkey wrench into this equation by resigning, which caused another election to be held on February 6th. On December 12th, the Supreme Court declared George Bush the new president. Finally, Clinton turned to negotiations again. On December 23rd, he laid out his parameters for new negotiations. A Palestinian state would be created on 94 to 96% of the land, with 1 to 3% land swaps. Early warning stations would exist in the Jordan Valley. In Jerusalem, Arab areas were Palestinian, Jewish areas were Israeli. On the Haram, either the Palestinians would have sovereignty over the Haram and the Israelis over the Western Wall, as well as the Holy of Holies, or Palestinians shared sovereignty over the Haram, and Israelis had sovereignty over the Western Wall, while sharing sovereignty over excavation. On refugees, Palestinians would return to the new Palestinian state without ruling out them returning to their land in Israel. Both sides had many reservations to this plan, but ultimately accepted in order to begin negotiations at Taba. From January 21st to January 27th at Taba in Egypt, the two sides negotiated with the Clinton parameters as a basis. A lot of ground was gained at Taba. The Israelis reduced their claim to the West Bank, proposing to annex either 5% of it or to annex 6% and lease out another 2%. On refugees, Israel showed some inclination to accept some responsibility for causing them to be refugees, and various figures were thrown over the amount of refugees that would be allowed to return. And Jerusalem remained a sticking point. This was the closest Israel had ever come to meeting Palestinian demands, but ultimately Barak would end negotiations in order to run in the February elections. He lost, and Ariel Sharon refused to continue where Barak had left off. Hey, thank you all for staying this long to the end of the video. I hope you all learned something. Someone should learn something. If you learn nothing, then okay. You can go home with what you have learned in this video so far. It's fine. So, with that, before I get into the patrons and stuff, I want to say that the recent events concerning Gaza have just been truly very devastating and upsetting for me. So I decided to link in the description a charity that you can use to help, if you're feeling charitable, that you can use to help, rebuild Gaza after the latest Israeli assault. I would very much appreciate if you could do that. And with that, I want to thank our patrons. I wasn't enforcing this before, but I'm going to start enforcing this now. All $7 and up patrons, so I think that's Rafiq, are going to get mentioned at the end of the videos. So just from the top, Rod B, Sailor Susie, Pyrotic Napalm, Avocado Kirby, Martial Law, and Ravignon. Thank you all so much for what you've contributed to this channel, and if anyone else would like to help make videos like this more common, please feel free to become a patron. I very much appreciate that. Subscribe, like, and share the video. Comment to me about all the things I got wrong. You can call me a liar, just like Ehud Barak does. I appreciate that. Anyway, That's it. That's months of my life are over now. Yay! We're done. Okay, bye.
So, being me, I forgot to mention two things. One, that if you want a sequel to this video, I will do so when this video hits 3,000 likes, just to cover the period after 2001, after the Taba summit towards the present. And the other thing, I want to thank all the people who lended their voices and just shout out their kind of socials and channels. I want to thank my friend Layla, a Palestinian American and DSA member. You can go follow her Twitter to support her. I want to thank Chill Goblin, a smaller YouTube channel, who offered their voice to this production. I want to thank Hayanomi, who offered their voice as well. I want to thank my friend Flying Tonk, and I want to thank big giant YouTuber Civil War Week by Week for providing his voice as well. I want to thank you all for your contribution. Links are in the description in order to see their stuff. Thank you. Have a good night.